You are on assignment.
We'll keep increasing sanctions.
Now, a behind-the-scenes look.
Welcome to On Assignment. I'm Imran Siddiqui.
And I'm Maru Pandey. Coming up, the U.S. Secretary of State wraps up major visits to Asia and the Middle East. We'll get some analysis.
Some strong media restrictions in Ethiopia result in the jailing of a VOA correspondent.
Curiosity has landed. We'll learn about the rover's mission on Mars.
And we return to another mysterious world. This one is underwater. So come on with us as we take you on assignment.
Hillary Clinton is the most traveled Secretary of State in U.S. history. She recently returned from the ASEAN summit in Cambodia and from stops in the Middle East, where Israel's leadership expressed concern about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt.
VOA State Department correspondent Scott Stearns traveled with Secretary Clinton, and we talked to Scott for more. He says that Ms. Clinton met in Egypt with President Morsi and the country's military, or SCAF, and that the ASEAN summit ended in a notable failure.
For the first time in ASEAN's 45 years, they failed to agree on a unified sort of closing statement, largely because of this South China Sea issue. China marine surveillance vessels conduct regular patrols as part of Beijing's bid to advance sovereignty and jurisdiction over the South China Sea, one of the world's busiest shipping lanes, rich in oil and gas. China's claim over most of those waters is disputed by Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, and Malaysia. China would much prefer to deal with these maritime disputes unilaterally, where, being China, it would clearly have an advantage over smaller countries. Those smaller countries, not surprisingly, would like to deal with this in the context of ASEAN. Part of the Obama administration's Asia pivot is the repositioning of both Marines and aircraft carrier task forces in the region. So the United States has an interest in keeping open a navigation through the South China Sea. And Secretary Clinton said that she felt this dispute should be resolved through ASEAN.
We believe the nations of the region should work collaboratively and diplomatically to resolve disputes without coercion, without intimidation, without threats, and certainly without the use of force.
And then she moved on to Egypt and Israel. What do you think people can walk out with as far as this particular trip is concerned to Egypt and Israel?
She really wanted to get a sense. Where's President Morsi coming from, and where does he want to go? And where's General Tantawi coming from, and where do they want to go? You know, this is a unique situation where many of the members of the Egyptian military have spent much of their career essentially harassing the Muslim Brotherhood, breaking up their rallies, throwing President Morsi in jail before he was the president. So now for the SCAF to look at President Morsi as being the civilian president, understandably, that's not going to be a smooth process. Secretary Clinton says she received from General Tantawi the assurance that SCAF would stick to its promise to complete a full transition to civilian rule.
The full transition to civilian rule, with all that entails. And we have commended the SCAF for representing the Egyptian people in the revolution, as compared to what we're seeing in Syria, which is the military murdering their own people. The SCAF here protected the Egyptian nation.
Within hours of meeting with Secretary Clinton, General Tantawi then issued a statement saying that the military would never surrender Egypt to any one group, which raised some additional considerations, some concerns about his intentions toward the Muslim Brotherhood.
And then Israel's concerns about the Muslim Brotherhood.
It surprised me that there was any one thing that Israel would be more concerned about than Iran. It's Egypt. Prime Minister Netanyahu, Foreign Minister Lieberman, Defense Minister Barak, President Shimon Peres, they all wanted to hear from Secretary Clinton about her impressions of the Muslim Brotherhood. There's real concern in Israel that while President Morsi says that he intends to respect Egypt's current treaties, real fear in Israel that ultimately the Muslim Brotherhood is going to abrogate its peace plan with Israel. Part of that is based on the Muslim Brotherhood's past. Part of that is based on how President Morsi has couched his acceptance of existing treaties. As you know, he said Egypt will respect treaties that its treaty partners respect. You could look at that as saying that Israel has not followed the letter, for instance, in Sinai, or in allowing for the return of Palestinians, which might give the Egyptian government the ability to say, well, okay, Egypt is not meeting the letter of the Egypt-Israeli peace treaty, so we don't have to either. A lot of concern as well among the Christian community in Israel and the Coptic Christian community in Egypt about the Muslim Brotherhood. Secretary Clinton got not a happy welcome. There were protesters outside of our hotel in Cairo. There were also protesters in Alexandria who threw bottles of water and tomatoes at Secretary Clinton's motorcade. There's a real fear among some elements of the Coptic Christian community in Egypt that the Obama administration has sided with the Muslim Brotherhood and is not adequately pressuring them to protect the rights of Christians in Egypt, who will now be living under a civilian government that is Islamic.
Scott Stearns is the Voice of America's State Department correspondent based here in Washington.
We're going to take a break now, but when we come back, a VOA correspondent talks about how he was thrown in jail while reporting in Ethiopia. You're watching On Assignment. Earlier this year in May, a veteran VOA correspondent was detained overnight by Ethiopian police on a charge of illegal reporting. Peter Heinlein and his translator were arrested as they were leaving a mosque on the outskirts of Addis Ababa. He joins us now on the set to talk about the ordeal. Hi, Pete. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Talk a little bit about why you were in Addis, what you were reporting on, what the situation was in Ethiopia at the time.
Correspondent in Addis, and the story was breaking about the Muslim mosque, one of the big mosques, where they had been teaching the Salafist brand of Islam, and the Grand Council of Islam in Ethiopia told them they had to change that and actually demanded that they fire some of the teachers. They were protesting and saying the members of the Grand Council had been put in there by the government and didn't represent the main strain of Islam that's practiced in Ethiopia, that they're members of a kind of a small sect that is considered heretical by the Salafists. So they're protesting and saying they wanted to have an election and it wanted to be held at the mosques, and the government was saying, no, 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 you can't do that. So they were saying, we want to do that, and they had a little protest rally, and I went to cover it.
When you went to cover it, what happened? Did you imagine that this would happen? It did end with your arrest.
No, I had no idea. In fact, I'd already left the mosque, was 10, 15 minutes away from the mosque, was driving away, and they stopped my car. And I got out and, well, actually I stayed in the car, but they took the driver's license and left us there. And there were people coming out of the mosque, 10,000 people, and pouring by. And I think the police panicked. And at some point, my phone rang. It happened to be somebody from VOA. But when the phone rang and I answered it, the police freaked and they grabbed me and ripped the phone out of my hand. They ripped my recorder out of my other hand. But fortunately, the people in VOA could hear what was going on. The line stayed open for 11 minutes after that. So I was very fortunate because then they immediately got on the horn and called people and got things straightened out.
Were you the only Westerner covering that meeting?
Unfortunately, yes. There was
so
a blockade.
You stood out in that crowd.
There was a blockade around the cordon around the mosque. I luckily got through, or maybe unluckily. Other reporters who tried to go weren't able to get in.
Talk about what happened quickly about your arrest. What happened exactly? How did you spent the night in jail? I
did, and that was a little bit rough. And I did take a few knocks during the arrest, but nothing
What
too
did they
serious.
say? Why did they say they detained you? Illegal reporting.
They
what
said,
was the explanation?
Yes, the police told me that they don't want foreigners reporting these things. They called it an internal affair, said foreign journalists have no business there, and so I was arrested because I was covering things in a way. They said, the police told me, that they didn't find appropriate.
And how did the U.S. authorities help you in
Fortunately, within 24 hours, the U.S. Embassy consular people were there at the hospital where I'd been taken the following day, and walked in and said, we've got everything straightened out, you're free to go. I was able to walk out of the hospital, pick up my gear, and go home, and was in custody less than 24 hours.
Wow. Wow, what an ordeal. Well, thank you, Pete, for joining us and sharing your story
You're
with us.
welcome.
It's quite
Thanks
an
for having
ordeal.
me.
Well, we're going to take another break now. Coming up, Curiosity has landed. We'll learn a lot more about the new rover's mission to Mars. You're watching On Assignment. Welcome back to the program. By now, you've probably heard that there's a new machine on the surface of Mars. It's NASA's Curiosity rover, which landed on August 5th using methods that had never been attempted before on the red planet.
The rover, which is the size of a small car, landed right on target after an 8-month journey. On Assignment's Philip Alexio is following this story and talked with Ross Irvin with the National Air and Space Museum. Mr. Irvin helped choose Curiosity's landing place. Let's take a look at that.
Dr. Ross Irwin III is a planetary geologist here at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, and he was also one of the members who helped select the site where Curiosity landed. Well, tell us a little bit about what it took to land, because we keep hearing about this 7 minutes of terror, or whatever you want to call it.
You come in through the atmosphere at very high speed, 13,000 miles an hour. You have a heat shield. The thing is able to guide itself through the atmosphere with a series of S-turns, just like the space shuttle was able to do coming in. And then, when it's still moving at Mach 2, it pops a parachute.
The parachute is deployed. We are decelerating.
And this parachute is designed to be able to open supersonically and slow the spacecraft down. But even then, the Martian atmosphere is so thin that that parachute would not allow it to land softly on the surface. It would hit hard. So what they do is then let go of the parachute, and there's a descent stage that then lowers the lander very close to the surface, and it's lowered down on the sky crane.
Standing by for sky crane. Sky crane has started.
Set down gently. And then that descent stage, which gave it that nice soft landing, flies off and crashes.
What's the most fascinating part of this mission for somebody like you?
When you land on the surface, obviously that's really exciting because this is a $2.5 billion mission. You really want it to work. Then once you land, you start to get a sense of where you are. You check out the engineering instruments. It's really a month or more in when you start really ramping up the science. That's the exciting part.
And why did they end up choosing that specific site?
Gale Crater has a lot to offer a very broad cross-section of the scientific community. If you're interested in deposits that have been laid down by running water, you have that. If you're interested in minerals that had been deposited by groundwater or surface water, they have that. Also in Gale Crater, you have this huge thickness of sediment deposited in the floor of the crater. And as you go up that section, the oldest rocks are exposed at the bottom, the youngest ones are at the top, and you can look at each layer of sediment in that crater like the pages of a history book in the surface of Mars, telling you about what the conditions were like farther back in time. And as you climb the mountain, you get into younger and younger rocks, which tells you about this transition from a warmer, wetter climate early in the history of Mars to the cold, dry climate that they have today.
Now, what is this rover going to be able to do that's not been able to be done before?
Curiosity has many of the kinds of instruments that we would have in a laboratory here on the Earth, and it's also fitted with the same kinds of tools that a geologist would carry if a geologist were to go out into the field. A geologist would carry a rock hammer, for example. Curiosity doesn't have a rock hammer, but it does have a drill. So you can knock off the crust of a rock and look at the minerals that are exposed inside. It has a little scoop so that it's able to collect soil samples. And then inside the body of the rover is a very sophisticated set of miniature laboratory equipment that is able to analyze the composition and the mineralogy of the soils and rocks of Mars, and to be able to figure out if there are any organic compounds in there that could be evidence of past life.
Now, there's also a laser that it's equipped with, and it's a high-powered laser. Explain how that works and how technologically advanced that is.
Well, that's something that geologists would not have when you go out into the field. So there is a laser mounted on top of the mast, and what that does is it's able to hit a rock several meters away. It vaporizes the surface of that rock, and then it's able to look at the composition of the material that's been vaporized. Very sophisticated instrument. We've never sent anything like that to Mars before.
And why make it a vehicle that moves as slow as it does? As I understand, it can basically go the length of a tennis court in about an hour.
Because Mars is so far away, the signal takes anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes or more to get to and from. So you can't sit here on the ground with a joystick and drive this thing. You have to tell it where you want to go at the beginning of the day and then let it do that. So very often they don't like these rovers to drive farther than what they can see at the beginning of the day.
All right, Dr. Ross Irwin, the planetary geologist here at the Air and Space Museum. Thanks a lot, and congratulations on being a part of all of that.
From one mysterious world to another now. In the U.S. state of Georgia, a dam was built in 1956, creating a reservoir known as Lake Lanier. The lake ultimately became the main source of drinking water for the city of Atlanta.
When the lake was created, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was supposed to destroy all the buildings that the water could cover. But Abdul Aziz Khan of Urdu TV says they didn't do quite that. Let's look at that story and some amazing underwater photography.
It is not what is on this man-made lake, but what is under it that has people very curious. When a dam was built over the Chattahoochee River in 1950s, 700 families left their homes, making way for 38,000 acres of water. 60 years later, this lake is now known for what people do on the water, but many still want to know what lurks below. After a couple of droughts, when water levels dropped, remains of some underwater structures emerged. The story of a submerged underwater town made the newspapers, and the myth of an underwater town under the surface of Lake Lanier was born. On April 7, 2012, a new expedition was launched, and a search team started scanning the surface of the lake with sonar. I decided to join the dive team myself. Lake Lanier was basically shown to me as one of the places where there could be ruins of a historical town that was flooded in 1950s.
And you guys dove in those waters and you found one of the homes of in that town.
At that time, we did not know what it was. We didn't know whether it was a church. We didn't know whether it was a storage facility or a home. The visibility was so bad that we could not see more than 5 feet away. One thing that I remember is that I was counting as I was descending. I was counting 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000. And I reached all the way up to 50,000 and there was nothing. So as I was looking at my depth gauge, I remember hit something, and that turned out to be the chimney of a Victorian style house. Normally we would not enter a structure like this because the roof can always collapse on you. But this roof had already collapsed. So we swam right into the rooms in search of furniture or any abandoned belongings. We desperately looked for a nameplate or something left behind that would give away the identity of the structure. But that material had already been removed, and there was nothing that the owners of the house had left behind. Many around Lake Lanier had fashioned an image of a small bustling town, sitting like some miniature Atlantis on the lake's bed. But the 56,000 acres bought by the government were mostly rural areas. The community that was evacuated was a sprawling rural community with farmhouses and farms without electricity or indoor plumbing, surrounded by vast tracts of wood.
What motivates you to do these kind of stories? You know, your stories talk about discovering stuff, you know, going out there, diving in waters. What pushes you?
See, the way I see it, every time you have the camera, you have the eyes of a million people in your hands, you know. And I want to do justice to that power. I want to do justice to that moment. And that is, I think, the driving force behind my stories. That, you know, what can I show them that they would say that, okay, it was a pleasure to hand over our eyes and our ears to you, and we would like to do that again.
And what about the fact that, you know, you're from Pakistan, and critics have been saying that there's a lot of anti-American sentiment in Pakistan, but here you work with Americans. How's your experience with regards to that?
I think America is a very culturally diverse society, so being a Pakistani in America does not carry the same surprise value. So personally, I have never encountered any prejudice or racism. In fact, people are extremely enthusiastic to share their stories with me. People are extremely enthusiastic to share their past and their history. So my personal experience has been positive.
And what about your audience in Pakistan? When they see you doing these kind of things, how's their reaction?
Of all these years, I have not heard a single comment from Pakistan which showed that there was people did not like the stories because they were on Americans. We did stories on Nazi U-boats and the Second World War, and our Pakistani audience was fascinated by it because the way they see it, there really is no such thing as American history or Pakistani history. History is history, and it exists independently of national perceptions and cultural perceptions, and that's how they take it.
It's an amazing story. Have you ever scuba dived?
I can't because I don't know how to swim.
At all?
Yeah, which is pathetic, but I'm going to learn. Yeah, next summer is my target.
Next summer?
Yeah.
Maybe then scuba diving?
Yep, absolutely.
All right. Well, young people in Kabul are pushing the boundaries of Afghanistan's conservative society, but they're doing so at the risk of severe social pressures and rebuke.
Graffiti artists in Kabul live hidden lives. One woman in particular is using graffiti to push for change for how Afghan women must dress. But she dares not even do it outside. VOA's Sharon Bain explains.
Graffiti in Kabul is a dangerous art. For Afghanistan's only female graffiti artist, Shamsia Hassani, it is almost impossible. Just being a woman alone on the street is not culturally acceptable. Then there are the daily dangers of a country at war.
I feel danger if I go to outside to do it in public way.
Shamsia believes her abstract figures of women in the body-covering blue burqas can help change how women think about themselves.
I just want to change the shape of burqa, because shape is very important. Because of shape, they can look very happy, and in real shape they are looks very sad. But I just bring it lots of designing, traditional designing on their burqa, and I just change it their shape to change their mind, to say that you can change yourself, you can change your mind.
Shamsia's only been able to paint outdoors at a graffiti event in Germany. But in Kabul, she has invented a solution. She photographs walls in the city, then paints on the photographs. She calls it digital graffiti. She says it's a way of bringing about change in Afghan society.
Graffiti is for people, for changing the idea of people. I think is my idea, that I want to change people's idea.
Her studio is tiny, and her art style is wide-ranging. But graffiti is where her heart is.
But graffiti is for always outside, for everybody, for always. And they will interested in graffiti with this art. And I think it's more effective than the other kind of art for developing art here in Afghanistan.
So she paints on the walls of a local protected, walled-in cafe. But Shamsia does graffiti at all in a country as conservative as Afghanistan is a sign of the changes here. But the fact that she's too fearful to take her art to the streets shows how change still comes slowly. Sharon Bain, VOA News, Kabul.
Well, that's our show for this time. Next week, we'll have new coverage of the crisis in Syria. We'll also find out how some old racehorses are helping prison inmates build new lives.
Remember, you can check out all of our past episodes at voanews.com and on Facebook and YouTube as well. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching On Assignment. See you next time.